Welcome to another episode of This Was Supposed to Be Easy.
We've had these conversations on at least 1,000 car rides and thought it might be time for other people to join us. This is Cheryl.
And my name's Amy. And today we have a guest with us, and that is Dr. JoDell Heroux. She is a professor of disability studies and has a lot of wonderful things that she's going to be sharing with us today. So welcome, JoDell.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank
So
you.
I can give you just a little bit of background on who I am and what I do, if that's helpful.
Perfect. Yes,
So
please.
I was a special education teacher for about 15 years and decided to go back and get my PhD because I was interested in preparing future special education teachers. And so I attended Michigan State University, and through my doctoral studies, I was introduced to this field called disability studies, which is a completely different way of thinking about disability than I had ever experienced because it's quite different from special education. So it was a profound shift for me. And so I decided to pursue that through my doctoral work. And then that has really, I guess, been a pivotal point for me and shifted my trajectory in higher education towards disability studies and kind of not necessarily away from special education, but trying to find a way to merge the two. But I think talking about disability from a disability studies perspective is unique. And I think that it has a lot of application to the things that you all are talking about in terms of like how things are supposed to be easy, right? And people that live with disabilities know that nothing's ever easy, right? And then those of us who are able, what we would consider non-disabled and don't have intellectual disabilities or mental health disabilities, often, life seems easier for us. But as we age, we tend to have more encounters with physical disabilities and even, right, memory issues, all of the things. We know that disability is the only minority group that anyone can join at any time. We just don't typically think about disability until it's right in front of us, whether it's someone we love or ourselves. We don't really think about it. And we don't think about how we move through space in a world that was designed for able-bodied, able-minded people until we're...
I have to stop for a second because you just said something that I don't think I've ever heard anyone say before. And I spend a lot of time hanging out with you. You just said disability is the only minority group that anybody can join at any time.
Yeah, temporarily or permanently, yes.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but that was like a mind-blowing statement for a second there.
It is mind-blowing. And that is exactly what brought me to disability studies. In my special education training, I'd never heard that. My first disability studies class, my professor said that, and it's like the world stopped for me. And I went, whoa, wait a second, huh? And honestly, at that time, I identify as a disabled woman, but I didn't tell anybody that I had a disability. And up until that point, I wasn't ashamed of it, but I just didn't talk about it and I didn't share it openly. And it was in that moment that I thought, oh my gosh, that's so true. Like it is the only minority group that anyone can join at any time. And often it's temporarily, but often it's also permanent. And so you could wake up one day and just disabled. And actually a very close friend of mine right now woke up one morning and couldn't feel his body from the waist down and is still working through what that is and is seeing specialists. And that literally happens to people where they wake up one day and they're experiencing disability and had never thought about it before. And now their entire world is consumed with that.
This is going to sound, I hear myself saying it already, and it's going to sound superficial, but I feel like I just had a moment of this feeling. I mean, I've had several lately as I get older, but it's making me think differently about the feelings that someone might have when they have, whether it's a long-term disability or a short-term disability, as you just described it.
Your reaction is so common because we're socialized to believe that disability is a bad thing and that we're all supposed to look a certain way and move a certain way and believe a certain way and, communicate in a certain way. And the reality is there's so much diversity in how we are, like how we just are as human beings, and that we tend to value certain ways of being over others. We value walking over using a wheelchair or a cane or a walker. And the reason I think this conversation is so incredibly important is, I don't know about you, but my mom is experiencing some disabilities. Like, her hearing is not as good as it used to be. She had to have shoulder surgery, and so she's not able to move in the way that she was before. But what's most interesting to me is how she's so averse to assistive devices, like using a wheelchair or a walker, or she doesn't want to leave the house. She also had to put that cream on her face, Cheryl, and would refuse to leave the house, right? And doesn't really want to use hearing aids, even though she's missing so much of her relationship with her friends because she can't hear them and can't engage in the conversation, but doesn't want to wear hearing aids because that means that there's something, quote unquote, wrong with you. Right. And this idea that it's so connected to age that there's this resistance to that too, right? That even though she has me talking to her all the time about, disability is not a bad thing. And it's not, there's nothing shameful about it, but we are so deeply socialized to believe that disability is bad and that we should try to hide it if we can. And the message that sends disabled people is terrible, and that they're somehow less valuable. And so that perspective just changed everything for me. So as a woman so I have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And what's interesting about that is so many people say, well, everybody has that. No, not everybody has that. And I do. And it manifests in different ways than other people who have the same disability. I also have generalized anxiety disorder. And people will say, like, a lot of people have anxiety. Yes, a lot of people experience anxiety, but they don't have an anxiety disorder. I do. But at the time that I was learning about disability studies, I wasn't ashamed of it, but I didn't really talk about it very much. And then learning that there's this thing called the medical model of disability, which most of us are socialized to believe. And that is that disability is a bad thing. Disability needs to be fixed or cured. And that's how most of us think about it. And so when we think about disability that way, then we're not honoring it, valuing it, elevating disabled people in ways that you do non-disabled people. And so that shifted everything for me. And the part that I found most incredible is that my daughters both have disabilities as well. And it changed the way that I interacted with them. It changed the way that I thought about them. And I was actually still teaching at the time when I learned about this field. I was teaching special education and I was in a resource room, and just knowing about a different way of thinking about disability, and it's called the social model. There's other models as well, but this is the one that just made me go, wow, okay. And from a social model perspective, we think about how society is actually disabling versus the impairment. So people have been born with impairments or acquired impairments, since the dawn of time, right? And initially, they weren't really meaningful. Like, a lot of people were born with disabilities or acquired disabilities through, life was very physical, right? Especially like in the 1400s, life was physical. And so things happened. Industrial revolution, like, people were getting injured by machines, and then there's wars. And so disabilities existed across time. And so it was a way of thinking about, so the social model of disability is a way of thinking about how the way that society is structured is what makes people experience disability as a barrier versus the impairment itself. So when we think about people who are deaf or hard of hearing who use American Sign Language, if we used American Sign Language as thinking of it as like bilingual and we all just learned it, there would be less exclusion of people who are deaf and hard of hearing. When we think about physically disabled people, so wheelchair users or people who use walkers or canes, like, having curb cuts matters, having elevators matters. When those things aren't in place is when they experience the feelings of being disabled. But it isn't their impairment itself that is necessarily disabling. It's when you're not able to access the same things as, quote unquote, non-disabled people, right? That's when you feel like, okay, this is problematic. And so what I love about the social models, it doesn't erase impairment, and it doesn't say that impairment doesn't exist, but what it does do is takes the spotlight off of the person and having the person feel like there's something wrong with them, and puts the spotlight on society saying, okay, we can do this better, and we can include more people, and we can honor and value the different ways that people move through space, right? So because of the political climate that we're currently in, there are a lot of disabled people that are reenacting the Capitol crawl for Section 504. And I had a student just recently who did that. And she got out of her wheelchair and crawled up the Capitol steps to do her speech. And it's that visual to show people that, yes, I use a wheelchair. And because society is presenting all of these barriers, I have to crawl up these steps because I can't actually walk up them. And so the social model was it completely changed the way that I thought about disability. I thought,
yeah, that's so interesting to think about. And that visual brings it, kind of makes it real as well.
yeah,
Because I think one of the things I hear you saying is that it really is something that could impact every single person, in a way, because we all have employees and we all have family members and we all have friends and individuals in our lives that we don't have to other in a way. We just have to create an environment that's for everyone all of the time anyway.
yes. And parents of children, so parents who have children with disabilities that are born with disabilities are the first place where inclusion really happens, right? They want their child involved in everything. So they figure out ways to include their child in all of the family things. One of the things I talk about with my students, because, they're teenagers or young 20-year-olds, young adults who don't often, like, disability is not at the forefront of their mind. When we talk about how disability can happen at any time, and like they could leave the classroom and something could happen and they either experience disability themselves or someone that they love and spend time with does. And then that shifts your entire perspective. And so we were talking about, imagine for a moment that someone that you love, your best friend or your roommate that you spend all kinds of time with, suddenly becomes disabled. And then that person who you want to go to concerts with, who you want to go to plays with, who you want to, go to amusement parks with, suddenly is experiencing those things very differently. And then suddenly it becomes, you become much more passionate about exclusion. You get angry about the fact that they're not able to do certain things with you because the world is not accessible to them. And in saying that, then the rest of the semester with the students, like, they'll come to class and be like, you are not going to believe what I saw this weekend. If my friend was a wheelchair user, they wouldn't have been able to do this. And so it shifts the way that we see the world versus shifting the way that we see people. And I think that's what is so incredibly powerful. And when we think about our friendship groups, and like every single one of us is going to have very close friends that are going to experience disability in ways that they either hadn't thought about or weren't prepared for. And I know for myself, like I have arthritis in my knee, which happens, because of age. And I can't walk in the ways that I used to, as far as I could or as fast as I want to. And I don't, like, would love to go hiking with friends. And it's harder for me. It's painful at this point. And
Lucky
then
for you, Amy's one of your friends because she's very clear that she is not going to be your hiking buddy.
And the hard part is, like,
Absolutely.
but I want to do it. I really want to do those things. And so, but even just recently, a couple of months ago, I was experiencing a lot of issues with my eyes and I was seeing double. I couldn't drive. Well, I technically could drive. I shouldn't drive. And so I really quit driving and then relying on people to be able to drive me places. And I'm someone who I think about disability all the time. I teach it, I live it. And so I even had those moments where I'm like, I don't want to be a burden on someone and make them have to drive me places. And then I thought, that is not a burden. Like, I had to actually, because even though I live in this world and I teach in this world, there's still, because you're so deeply socialized to believe certain things, it is hard. Those things still creep up and you have to, and when it does, I'm so aware of it. And I'm like, oh, wait, like that, no, that's not real. That's just what the world has told me to believe, but that's not actually real.
Right.
Because people that love you and want to spend time with you never think that it's a burden to take you anywhere or do anything for you. They just don't.
Right. When you allow them to be able to support whatever that need is, and they're getting to spend that time with you that they might not have been able to, spend with you or engage in the full activity with you. The other perspective is, oh, it was an honor. I got to spend time doing this thing.
Because we have value beyond what our physical body can do. And that's sometimes what I think people forget. When you acquire a disability later, somehow our physical ability is so wrapped up in our value and even our intellectual ability, right? That wanes a little bit as we age. Like somehow we lose value because we forget things. And that's not true. So I think that is the gift of disability studies, at least for me. It was a huge gift wrapped up in a great big bow. Like disability is not bad and you are not a burden because you need supports or you need accommodations. That does not make you a burden. And that trope is just so prevalent in film and in books and honestly just the ways that we move through the world, newspaper articles and television shows. Like we see that all the time where disabled people are viewed as a burden to the family or a burden to their friends. And it doesn't have to be viewed that way. And it shouldn't be viewed that way. And so when we're thinking, I just love that you're doing this work around friendship and this idea that it was supposed to be easy. I don't know who told us that anything was supposed to be easy. I don't know why in our minds, because we do as little kids, we're like, oh, it's going to be easier when I get older. Who lied to you?
But even now, like one of the things that I am growing this awareness of is how we in our social media, right? Like we put the good stuff out there. We
Yes.
make it look so much better than the actual experience or day to day or whatever it is, actually is. We're just kind of always putting this prettier fake whatever persona out there of our life.
And I think what's so important, Cheryl, instead of thinking about like, oh, everybody's going to be looking at me and I'm not as pretty as I usually am and I can't cover it up. Why? Why do we have to cover it up? Because you're human. Like these things that we experience are human. And there are people in the audience who have experienced that, who are looking at you like, oh, it isn't just me, right? I didn't have
Yeah.
this alone. But it's so hard, right? Because we're just so deeply aware of our socialization towards especially beauty, right? That we have these beauty standards that we have to adhere to. And especially when you're up in front of so many people, like it's a very, I would think normal, I use normal in air quotes, mind you, typical way of feeling, right? That you feel like you should present a certain way when you have to get up in front of a room full of people. But at the end of the day, like, do you? Like, what does it mean to other people if you don't look that way? Like, I mean, as a woman who has resided in a larger body the majority of my life, I remember as a young girl feeling like my first thing would be I'd look in a room and go, am I the biggest girl here? And when I wasn't the biggest girl there, I was like, shoo. And then I was like, what? And now as an adult, I think about that and go, what was that? And part of it was I didn't want to feel alone. And the other part of it is I don't want to be stared at, right? But people who reside in larger bodies exist. And that is the least interesting thing about us. And I would say disability, most disabled people also believe that that is the least interesting thing about them. The women that I know, women and men that I know, and non-binary people, like all of the people who I know that are wheelchair users feel like that's the least interesting thing about them. Like a lot of people still use the terminology wheelchair bound, and that it isn't that. Wheelchair users don't see their wheelchair as confining them. It's actually what allows them mobility. And so it's not a bad thing. And they don't look at their chair as something that's problematic. It's a tool that helps them be more independent and engage and be able to be included and do things. And so we're trying to get people to stop using things like wheelchair bound or that people suffer from their disability, even though we know that some disabilities involve a lot of pain. And yes, that causes suffering. But just a disability in and of itself, like having autism, doesn't necessarily mean someone's suffering. Having cerebral palsy does not mean someone is suffering. So we're trying to challenge those ableist ways of thinking and talking about disability. And I think as we think about our friendships as women in our friendship group, thinking through like how will we show up for one another as we age and things become, our bodies don't function the way that they used to. Like how are we going to show up for one another and with one another? And also thinking about, we have children and there are some of us whose children have been identified as having disabilities. And so how do we show up for our friends who are parents of children with disabilities or grandparents of children with disabilities, right?
I do want to step back in to one of the things that was said earlier, if I can kind of jump back into it. And it was almost that idea of waking up and realizing you have a disability. Where I see a lot of people talk about this is it's almost like the idea of this now new disability. And even when you were mentioning earlier, like the anxiety and having an anxiety disorder, being someone who experiences anxiety versus somebody who has an anxiety disorder. When I don't know how to word this, so please help me. When does that switch happen? Because what I think happens is that especially individuals with newer developed disabilities kind of come in to say like, oh, I'm now experiencing this, but it's not a disability. And I feel this way, but it's not a disability. And they start kind of building on that terminology when someone else will be like, yes, that is a disability. And there are things that you can do to improve your quality or experience or tools available to you to have a different experience with that. So when does that kind of happen, especially in those that it hasn't been a lifelong thing for them? It's been something that this situation happened, X happened, and now Y is the outcome. And how do we kind of get those individuals who might be listening right now saying, wow, I experience life like that too, but I've never thought of the way that I'm experiencing life as a disability?
Oh my gosh, that's such a great question. And we grapple with that every semester with my students, especially for those with less apparent disabilities that often don't think that what they're experiencing is a disability or don't have a diagnosis of a disability. And honestly, so many people in the disability studies community or in that believe in the social model actually don't oppose that idea of self-diagnosis. And so anytime that it's chronic, or happens more like you're experiencing it more often than not experiencing it, I think we could consider it a disability. And even that, there are a lot of people who have impairments that don't consider themselves disabled and don't actually access accommodations or identify as disabled. And I would say that a lot of that has to do with ableism and internalized ableism and that medical model of disability, that belief that if I identify as disabled, my entire life changes and people look at me differently. And all of a sudden I'll experience barriers. And so people with less apparent disabilities, so anxiety disorders or, ADHD, dyslexia, all of the less apparent disabilities, often what we call mask and try to present as non-disabled because of the barriers they experience or the worry of the barriers they're going to experience if they disclose. And so often that's a lot of people feel like, and it's true. These are justified fears because of the way that society thinks about disability. People who openly acknowledge, yes, I have dyslexia, or yes, I have ADHD, or yes, I have an anxiety disorder, their access to gainful employment is much more limited. It just is. As soon as people know that you have a disability, so their fears are justified. Where I would love to see the switch is like our society is shifting. Disabled people are much more vocal. They're out on social media. People are owning their disabilities and talking about how they're not a bad thing. They make me who I am. Hearing disabled people say, even if they could cure it or even if they could fix it, I don't want them to, because this is the body I have. And I'm really good with how it maneuvers through space, and it is who I am. I think that is what's shifting the perspective societally, is that disabled people are talking more about their experience and pushing back on this idea that it's shameful and that I shouldn't be visible, right? I do think that we are seeing what's hard is trying to hold two things simultaneously, right? This idea that disabled people are really becoming much more visible, vocal, and present, and also politically now also still being excluded. And even the laws that have been designed to protect them, they're challenging those now. So it's a strange time to be in, where the disability community is really coming together and coalescing around this idea, like, we're here, like, you cannot ignore us. And politically, this climate of go back, like, exclude, do not help, do not support. And so I feel like it's hard to talk about this right now because I'm in that disability community that's like, woohoo, raise us up. We're disability pride all the way. And yet politically, knowing that they're attacking Section 504 and they want to dismantle the ADA and special education. So it's trying to hold both of those things it's becoming painful, I think, for disabled people and also non-disabled people who love disabled people, but also non-disabled people who now know that ability is fragile. It's not forever. Like being able to walk, talk, see, hear, like that's not forever. Like it's a fragile state of being. And so people that own that and know that, I think are also now supporting the disability community in ways that they hadn't before. And so
I'm going to say this in kind of a different way, but like almost that idea that some people hold in their head that I'm not disabled enough to
right.
consider myself a part of the
Oh,
disabilities community.
you're
And
talking about the
so,
hierarchy of disability.
right, like, do
that
I
doesn't
have to
exist.
have check 4 boxes to be able to say I'm, part of this group? And how can we kind of get away from that mindset? Because I think there's so many people that, like, again, as they're listening, are saying, wow, what you're saying really resonates with me. I hear this. I also experience life in the way that you're saying, but I've never thought of myself as disabled. Could I label myself as that? Am I disabled enough?
Yeah.
And that's that, I mean, and that, how do we shift away from that mindset?
I love that question because, and I did know that that's what you asked.
Yeah, okay. It
I was
popped back in.
like, okay, I feel like I got away from that. But so what you're really referring to is this idea of a disability hierarchy where
Yeah.
we talk about people from least disabled to most disabled. And that's perpetuated through terminology like low functioning and high functioning, right? And that happens a lot when we're talking about people with autism. Well, they're high
Yeah.
functioning autistics versus low
Yeah.
functioning autistics. And we talk about disability as on a spectrum, which it is, but it's not a line spectrum. It is a round spectrum, right? Where we can experience different things at different times. The disability hierarchy does not exist. And I would argue that that is a non-disabled way of thinking about disability that we've internalized. Even if we have a less apparent disability, we have this tendency to think, yeah, okay, so but I have a disability, but I'm not as disabled as this person. So my disability, I don't need all of that support. I don't need all of that help. And what I would say to someone is that people in the disability community don't think about disability as a hierarchy like that. And we believe that we are a community, whether you're a wheelchair user or you use ASL or have hearing aids or cochlear implants or whatever the things, Braille, that all of us are valuable and all of us exist. And we don't look at it as a hierarchy of need where I don't have needs as a disabled person because I'm not a wheelchair user. Like, so I experience disability less. It's less of an impact on my life, even though that's true. Like it could be less difficult. Like we don't, not people with non-apparent disabilities often don't experience physical barriers like people who have apparent disabilities do. However, people who have physical or visible or apparent disabilities don't experience the challenges that people with non-apparent disabilities do. For example, like if you're a wheelchair user, most people recognize that you need an elevator or you need, a ramp and you need curb cuts. People who have less apparent disabilities like ADHD or generalized anxiety disorder often have to fight for accommodations in ways that are expected to prove that they need them, right? Because you can't see them. So often people will be like, oh my gosh, could you just like smile for gosh sakes? Like, can you just like life is good. Just enjoy think of what's happy in your life as if that's something that a disabled person can control. And asking for accommodations in ways that like we have to prove it. And you can't prove it because you can't see it. You can't visibly touch it or experience it. It's inside someone. And so there's this onus on the individual to prove that they need and deserve those accommodations. Where when there's a visible disability, you get less of that pushback. The trick with that too, though, is that there are people who have apparent disabilities and also not apparent disabilities, right? Because disability is so complex. We experience it on multiple levels. And then there's also then the intersections of race and sexual orientation and all of those things and poverty and things like that, that also converge to make living with a disability even more difficult. So I would say to anyone who experiences disability but doesn't identify as disabled to just really ask themselves why. So why not access accommodations or ask for them And sometimes people don't really need them. They make their own accommodations and that works. But if you're experiencing things in your job or at school or in even social circles that you might need more accommodations in some way, why not identify as a disabled person? Like really think about what prevents you from doing that. And I would say most often it's because we've internalized the belief that it's bad. And the question then becomes a burden. So I have a lot of students who have less visible disabilities who won't go to student disability services and get accommodations. And most often it's because they don't want to be viewed as less capable. And that is a societal perspective, like that's a societal thing. It isn't real. But their worry about that is real because of the society that we live in. And so I understand why they feel that way, but I also really try to encourage them to access their services if they need them. And so, yeah, the disability hierarchy, I get that question every semester from students because there is this belief that I'm less disabled than this person, and this person has a harder life than I do. People in the disability community just don't really think about it that way.
You're really making me think. I'm thinking back to that as a friend sort of scenario, and just really am grateful to you for sharing that perspective of why are we afraid? Why are we afraid to acknowledge it or put so much effort into masking
Mhm.
or hiding? And what does that mean for our friendships and what does that mean for our relationships? And I don't know how this connects, but everything you're saying just makes me think of a very recent situation. I take professionals on study tours and was recently on a trip to Italy. One of our participants had a heart attack about 10 days before the trip.
Oh my gosh.
And literally prior to even leaving the hospital was like, "Can I go to Italy?" To the doctors. "Can I go
Uh-uh.
to Italy? Say I can go to Italy." And the doctors are, if you take care of yourself, if you make sure not to walk as much or as fast. And so she's texting me from the hospital. "Do you think we can make this work?" And I was like, "Absolutely, 100%. I am, we'll get a taxi for this. We'll order you wheelchairs for the airport." And, did all the things to make that happen. And from the friend perspective, I was so very happy to be able to still travel with my friend because they were saying, "Hey, I need this extra support." At the same time, when we landed in an airport in another country and there wasn't a wheelchair sitting at the gate, she's like, "It's okay, I can walk." But the further and further and further we walked, the more we were all thinking, "No, this, like, we have to stop this right now." And the difficulty that we encountered because, well, the wheelchair was at the gate. Well,
Mhm.
it wasn't at the gate, and now we need it. And they're like, "But we can't give it to you right here in the middle of the airport. You have to go back to the gate." And we're like, "That was miles ago. Like, we can't go back to the gate." I think we were in that moment of, "No, I think I can do it. I think I can persist without the accommodation that I need." And then when we realized we needed it, I sort of said, "Is it okay if I tell people why you need it?" And so I just started that, "She just had a heart attack." And, I had to say something that would, kind of make them rethink what they were telling us. And
Right, because I'm gonna guess because that individual walked that
yes,
far, that now well, she obviously doesn't need it. If she was
yeah,
able to walk this far, then you didn't need it,
yeah. So
right? Because we
you're
don't
saying
think
so
about
many things.
ambulatory yeah, we don't think about ambulatory wheelchair users ever.
Yeah. Yeah, just you're just making me think about that whole experience from so many different angles, right? Like, I was so happy that we were able to do this thing together, but also both all of us had to take on that, "Wait a second, no, it's okay to insist." And unfortunately, sometimes we had to get very real with, "This is the problem and you can't tell us no."
Mhm.
But
Right.
I was happy that all in all, we were able to make it work. And also, then traveling back to say, "Okay, now we
Mhm.
learned something and we're going to wait at the gate
Yeah.
and get what we need."
I feel like disability studies was such a gift to me. And that's what I mean. Like it was wrapped up in a box with a big old bow because
Mm.
I can't even articulate how it's changed my life and how it will continue to change my life because of thinking about disability so differently, thinking about it societally instead of individually. Like
Yeah.
changed everything for me.
And being your friend and getting to hear about that changes everything for me.
Aw.
And so, for our listeners, what are some of the next steps? So, as somebody who might be sitting here listening and see disabilities differently, maybe for somebody that they love or for themselves, if they want to know more about disabilities, loving somebody with a disability, loving themselves with a disability, knowing how to advocate, knowing what they can do, how they can ask for services, all those hard things that we think should be easy that aren't. What are next steps for them? Like, what could they do? What could somebody who's listening today do on their own to learn more, keep this kind of as a journey for them?
There are so many things to do. Um, the first I would say is if you are a social media person, start following disabled people on social
Mm.
media. There are so many people out there that are doing this work that are disabled themselves, and being able to see yourself represented is so important. So, Keith Jones is a phenomenal individual. Imani Barbarin is a great person to follow. Tiffany Yu has a book called The Anti-Ableist Manifesto is phenomenal. That's an amazing book to start with. She's a disabled individual, disabled minority woman who talks about ableism and also not just starts with ableism, but then leads into like what you can do within your communities, your individual relationships, communities, and then globally what we can start to do. So she works us through like, yes, once you know about ableism, she talks about things that you can actually do to actively challenge it. And so she's phenomenal. But there are so very many people out there that are doing this work. So I would say read disabled people's books. There are many, many good ones out there. Follow social media activists and also join your local disability groups. So there are a lot of disability rights coalitions. They are right here in Michigan, but they're all around the nation. Like start looking for organizations to kind of join and start connecting with other disabled people would be some of my recommendations. And the other is if you're interested in knowing more about disability studies, look for some like here at Central Michigan University, we have a graduate certificate in disability studies, but there are disability studies programs everywhere. The University of Hawaii at Manoa has them, Syracuse. So they're and most of them are online because the idea is that, things need to be maximally accessible. So I would say for people who are maybe in like HR or in different professional fields that really want to know more about how to support their employees, that a disability studies certificate would really be helpful in really thinking through ways to challenge ableism and create a more inclusive space. But those types of programs actually they're for anyone, honestly. So anyone interested in learning more about the social model of disability, the human rights model. I like the radical model, which I could talk to you more about at some point. But yeah.
I love that you gave us so many access points from social media to books to graduate certificates.
There's lots of places to start.
So inclusive.
Try.
Well, so I really appreciate you being here and sharing all of these wonderful things with us and our listeners and allowing that. And we'll make sure to have more information and kind of all of these what they can do next steps on our website for people to be able to access or on our own social media, since you gave a lot of great names and I'm sure people are rewinding and re-listening and trying to write them down. So we'll make that easy for people to get into with that. But
Thank you so much,
yes.
JoDell.
Thanks
Yes.
for having me.
Thank you. Thanks for tuning in to This Was Supposed to Be Easy. Remember, the best stories are the ones where we live.
Join us next time as we uncover more tales and thoughts that just might change your world while we navigate those things that we didn't expect to be so hard.
Stay curious, stay connected, and keep wondering.